He didn't look like most of the other people in the reading room of the British Museum. He was older than many of the university students who sat hunched over their books, researching their theses. He was in his 60s, with thick white bushy hair that bunched out over his ears, and a white wiry beard and mustache that hid the expression of his mouth. He had a high forehead, narrow crinkly eyes, and prominent dark eyebrows. He didn't look like the other people in the library either. Most of them were neat and well-dressed scholars who were pursuing favorite interests or professional projects. But he was wearing a shabby dark coat with frayed cuffs, and there were holes in his shoes. He also didn't seem to be doing much reading. He was writing furiously on notepaper, sometimes scratching out words, sometimes shuffling through his papers to find some previous remark, sometimes crumpling up a sheet and starting all over again. He never lifted his eyes from his work, but when he entered or left the library, he often nodded hello to the librarians or some of the other patrons. The nod was all. He never engaged in light conversation, which he considered a waste of time. The regulars all knew him well. He was almost a daily visitor to the reading room, and had been for many years. Some even knew his name. "Good morning, Mr. Marx," they'd say. But no one knew what it was that he worked on so fervently, or why he always looked so serious, or when he would ever finish his consuming work. What Karl Marx was working on those days in the late 1800s was a book he'd hoped would change the world. It was a book he spent half his life writing, and a book he never did finish. But his friend Friedrich Engels would finish it for him, all 1,000 pages. Sometime after its release, Das Kapital and the principles it described would indeed change the course of world history. The ideas of Karl Marx became the basis for social and political revolution in several countries, most notably the Soviet Union. His philosophy, known to the world as Marxism, had as extensive an impact as any philosophy in known history. Marxism is one of the great modern visions of human life and society, and also one of the most controversial. It was embraced by nations in Europe and the Far East, and by some in South America. It was despised by many countries in the West, where Marx will forever be blamed for the world conflicts of the 20th century. It was American songwriter Irving Berlin who wrote, "The world would not be in such a snarl had Marx been Groucho instead of Karl." Communism, which resulted from Marxism, but is not always the same thing, is one of the dominant political forces of this century. It's a force that conflicted head-on with opposing democratic and capitalist forces. For a long and tense period of history, it seemed as if both forces couldn't coexist on the same planet, or at least they couldn't coexist harmoniously. For that reason, the citizens of the 20th century were caught in the middle of an epic struggle of forces, a struggle in which the connection and differences between Marxism and communism often became blurred. Yet Marxism continues to be a living philosophy that's accepted with different degrees of commitment and with different interpretations by a great many people today. Marx's desire to formulate a new society had much to do with the economic conditions of his time. In the mid-19th century, when he worked on Das Kapital, factory conditions were miserable. Workers had no unions and no rights. Women and children were forced to work long, tedious hours. Wages were barely adequate, and often not even that. And there were few groups or governments who advocated reform. Marx decided it was time to take a new look at capitalism, to see who benefited and who didn't, and how it affected the well-being of society at large. This examination led him to ultimately condemn capitalist methods and call for change. His rallying cry, "Workers of the world, unite," was repeated by groups of people in different countries all over the globe. In many places at different times they did unite. Whether this led to better conditions, or whether they traded one set of dreary circumstances for another, is a matter of opinion. Either way, the resulting changes can't always be attributed to Marx, who, although offered the initial inspiration, had no control over the final results. Karl Marx was born on May 15, 1818, in the small Prussian town of Trier, now in Germany. He was of Jewish descent, and many of his relatives had been rabbis, teachers, and scholars in the Jewish community. But Marx's father had converted to Christianity 2 years before Marx was born, because laws against Jews were making it hard for him to do well in his profession. After that, he went on to become a successful lawyer. Marx Sr. was an educated liberal with a taste for philosophy, especially that of Immanuel Kant. Karl was one of 8 children, most of whom didn't survive childhood. He was the second, and he was his parents' favorite. In school, he was only an average student, doing his best work in German, history, and the classics. He had very liberal teachers, so liberal that the secret police were watching the school all the time. One teacher, who was a progressive Democrat, was fired for his beliefs. Surrounded by all this liberalism, Karl began to develop a social conscience when he was still very young. In a school essay about what he'd like to do with his future, he wrote, "According to history, the greatest men are those who have worked for the general good. Experience calls him the happiest who has made most people happy." After his primary schooling, Marx studied at Bonn University, but he had no clear sense of direction yet. His father wanted him to be a lawyer, like he was, but Karl spent most of his time studying art and the classics and writing poetry. Much of his poetry was dedicated to a young woman named Jenny van Westphalen, a childhood friend to whom he'd become secretly engaged. Jenny was a beautiful, educated aristocrat who was the direct descendant of an earl. She rejected many other suitors in favor of Karl, who she believed from the start had a gifted mind and important contributions to offer humanity. She would later stand by him through enormous hardship and sacrifice. Her father liked Karl, but the rest of her family thought he was a bad bet. Even Karl's father opposed their union because he worried Jenny would end up sacrificing herself to his son's keen but compulsive mind. It was a prophetic fear. To the despair of his father, Marx also got involved in a lot of typical college antics. He drank with his friends, got into brawls, ran into debt, and even fought a duel once. He also spent one night in jail on a charge of disorderly conduct. After a year of this frolic, he transferred to the University of Berlin, where life would suddenly take a far more serious course. In Berlin, Marx was still supposed to be studying law, but instead he found himself drawn to philosophy. Law, he decided, was a profession for parasites. He joined a circle of young students who were followers of the philosopher Hegel. Hegel was very popular and trendy in the days Marx was in college. His main theory was that historical progress was always the result of conflict between old ideas and new ideas. From this opposition there would be a synthesis, and that synthesis was what moved society forward. Marx joined the young Hegelians, a group of students who would meet to discuss and argue about their philosophical ideas. Sometimes they would debate late into the night, empty wine bottles strewn about, and dozens of cigar stubs filling the ashtrays. Marx, although the youngest, was one of the best and fiercest debaters. In his spare time, he filled his notebooks with long romantic poems to Jenny. In Berlin, Marx became aware for the first time of the appalling conditions in which much of the working class lived. He became aware, too, of the luxury of the upper classes. After he graduated, when he was 23, he began to write articles for small liberal papers in which he attacked the government of Prussia. When the government censors moved to shut down the paper, Marx decided to leave for France, where he thought there might be support for his ideas. France had a revolutionary past and was home to some of the most radical thinkers of his day. Marx married Jenny and headed for Paris. In marrying Marx, Jenny lost her family's approval and its financial support. In France, where he met many workers, students, radicals, and activists, Marx began to turn away from Hegel. Hegel, he felt, was too theoretical. What Marx wanted was action, not theory. Criticism of ideas and institutions were not enough to change them. Political and social work had to follow. To Marx, German philosophy divorced man from reality, making him a mere spectator of the process in which he was involved. Still in his early 20s, Marx was more of a social democrat than anything else. He hadn't yet formed the key principles of Marxism. In Paris, Marx worked briefly on another periodical, in which he published only 2 articles. The first one asked why man had created religions for himself, and answered by saying that man's political, social, and economic life didn't fulfill him. Therefore, he had devised supernatural stories that could offer the hope of happiness. This article was where Marx first stated publicly his famous belief that religion was an opiate for the masses. He also wrote about how philosophy needed to be overcome and transformed into social revolution. This work, he said, was the work of the oppressed classes, which he called the proletariat. The main aim of the proletariat, he said, was to abolish private property. For to Marx, all the selfishness and social injustice that made life unbearable was based on the desire to have and protect private property. The ideas that would later lead to communism were beginning to express themselves. Marx found France fertile ground for his developing ideas. There he studied classical English economists like Adam Smith and made the acquaintance of German socialists living in exile and French and Russian socialists. Marx read voraciously hundreds of books, and he became especially knowledgeable about economics. The more he met and worked with socialists, the more he came to the conclusion that socialists, although more in touch with reality than German philosophers, needed something to give their ideas unity, vision, and purpose. But by far the most important contact Marx made in Paris was with a young writer who, in spite of the fact that his father was a wealthy owner of cotton factories in Germany and England, had dedicated himself to the welfare of the working class. His name was Friedrich Engels. For the rest of Marx's life, Engels would serve as his friend, his collaborator, his disciple, and his patron. It was one of the most loyal and enduring friendships in the history of politics. Engels had taken a position on his father's farm at an early age, where he had seen firsthand the struggles of the working class. While serving in the military in Berlin, he too had become interested in the philosophy of Hegel, and when he returned to his father's estate in England, he wrote a study of the English working class. Marx met him when he submitted an article to Marx's short-lived newspaper in Berlin. When he was 27, Marx was expelled from France because of his writing and went to Brussels. Along with him came Jenny and their first child, a daughter also named Jenny. And following behind them was Engels. They started planning a series of books about the history of socialism, and together made a 6-week trip to England, where Engels showed Marx the widespread poverty and hardship the industrialist age had created for the working class. These gloomy conditions, so well described in the novels of Charles Dickens, had a strong effect on Marx. The two returned to Brussels, where they established links with several different workers' organizations. The biggest of these had groups spread throughout Europe. Marx and Engels began to give lectures for this organization and helped build a network of international contacts. They soon became the most active and effective members of the organization, which became known as the Communist League. Finally, they were commissioned to write a summary statement of the principles and aims of the League. The result was the famous pamphlet, The Communist Manifesto, which appeared in London the following year. Engels believed the document would, in his words, do for history what Darwin's theory had done for biology. The basic premise, as stated in the manifesto, was that all history is the history of class struggle. It stated that there were two great hostile camps, two great classes, directly facing each other in modern society. They were the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie were those who owned the factories, businesses, and lands of a country. The proletariat worked for the bourgeoisie and owned nothing. The manifesto called the bourgeois greed for profit, and its exploitation of workers naked, shameless, direct, and brutal. It called for an end to private property and ownership, and the abolishment of the class system, through the rising up of the workers. It was in the manifesto that Marx and Engels coined their famous slogan, "Workers of the world, unite." 1,000 copies of the manifesto were printed in Germany. Few people heard of it, and even fewer read it. But just the same, a revolutionary fervor was beginning to spread throughout Europe. When the manifesto was released, Marx was in Belgium buying weapons for the workers and planning an armed uprising. He was expelled by the Belgian police and headed back to France, where a recent revolution had made the climate more welcoming. He began meeting with German exiles, helping plan a revolution in that country. Then he moved back to Germany, where he wrote articles in support of the many uprisings occurring all over Europe, most of which had been unsuccessful. He condemned the brutal way these uprisings were being put down, and suggested the workers should respond with acts of revolutionary terrorism. When he was 31, the German government had had enough, and they arrested him as a provocateur. At his trial, Marx gave a lengthy and eloquent speech about his beliefs and work, and claimed the rulers of Prussia had broken the law themselves by their counter-revolutionary deeds. The jury found him not guilty and thanked him for his informative lecture, but it was clear that it had once again become time to leave his homeland. By now, Karl and Jenny Marx had 3 children, 2 daughters and 1 son, and no place to call home. When France refused to let them stay, they moved to London, where they would remain for the rest of their lives. Eventually, it would feel like home, but first there were long years of desperate poverty and hardship ahead. For the first 6 years, the Marx family lived in a small apartment in Soho. Marx had no job and spent most of his time writing. Bills were often paid by pawning their meager possessions. Marx said they pawned everything, and his words, that wasn't nailed down. For periods of time, they would eat nothing but bread and potatoes. Marx told Engels, "I pity my wife, the main burden falls on her." Engels, meanwhile, was working for his father, earning about $10 a week. He sent as much as he could to Marx, and without his help, the family would never have survived. As it was, they lost 2 babies and their 8-year-old son, Edgar. When one of his children died, Marx called it a sacrifice to bourgeois misery. When a daughter, Franziska, died, Jenny Marx dashed about in a frenzy, trying to borrow money for a coffin. Jenny Marx herself suffered recurring illnesses and had several breakdowns. The children were trained early on to lie to the creditors, saying, "Mr. Marx isn't upstairs," and at one point, Marx had to flee to Manchester to avoid them. A spy sent by Prussia to keep tabs on Marx reported that the 2-room apartment had only shoddy, broken furniture and a jumble of worthless items. He said a rag-and-bone man would step back ashamed from such a remarkable collection. Marx he described as a man of genius and energy, who seldom washed and liked to drink while he worked. He would remain idle for days at a time. Then, in a flurry of inspiration, he would work days and nights without stopping. Through most of his life, Marx was subject to long periods of apathy and depression when he could accomplish nothing. He was also prone to illnesses, many of which seemed psychosomatic, and occurred at moments of defeat or despair. It was in these days, in the tiny, noisy apartment, that Marx began frequenting the reading room at the British Museum. For 6 years, the Marxes lived in squalor, and then things picked up a little. The same year their daughter Eleanor was born, Jenny received an inheritance from her uncle. Then Jenny's mother died and also left her a small inheritance. At the same time, Marx was able to sell a few articles to the New York Daily Tribune. The family was finally able to move into a larger house in North London. The poverty continued, although not as severe, and Marx tried to get a job as a clerk, but his handwriting was so bad his application was refused. Through it all, Marx continued to work on his theories, prompting his mother to comment, "I wish Karl would accumulate some capital instead of just writing about it." The times were hard, but according to his daughter Eleanor, they were not unhappy times. She remembers her father as bubbling over with fun when he played with his children. He liked to make up stories for them and to read them myths and classics like the Arabian Nights. The family went on weekend picnics where the children played while the adults sat around and talked politics. At home at night they would sometimes sing ballads, and Marx would read passages from Shakespeare or recite poems he knew by heart. When he was 45, Marx's mother died, leaving yet another inheritance to the family. Marx, whose political fervor held no room for wasted sentiment, told Engels, "In the circumstances, I am needed more than the old woman." The family moved again to an even nicer house, but there were still visits to the pawn shop, and there were still continual illnesses. Now Marx suffered from a painful case of boils, which he described as a truly proletariat disease. When he was 46, Marx helped found the International Working Men's Association, commonly known as the First International. It was made up of workers from all over Europe who were committed to radical change. For several years, Marx committed his time and energy to the International, attending meetings, writing its reports, and formulating its principles. He was building a power base for the future. But the International was plagued with problems from the start. The members held widely different viewpoints. Some were anarchists, some were unionists, some wanted revolution, and some wanted reform. It finally fell apart under the weight of internal politics and struggles for control. While his work on the International was proceeding, Marx was able to finish and publish the first part of his book on economics, Das Kapital. Few people bought it, and Marx made no money from it. Engels, who had sold his share of his father's business, paid off all of Marx's debts for him, and then established a yearly stipend for the family. Then, in 1871, an event in France finally brought attention to Marx's writing. France was defeated in a war against Prussia, and the workers of Paris refused to accept the defeat. They set up a community in the middle of the city which they called a commune, armed themselves, and fought troops in the city streets. The workers became so violent they had to be brutally suppressed by government forces. The whole event lasted only 10 weeks, but it was a bloody 10 weeks, and there were many deaths. People began to believe that the Commune had taken its name from Marx's Communist Manifesto, and so overnight his fame began to increase. There were some who believed he even helped organize the revolt. As the years wore on, Marx gave up thinking he would see a successful revolution of workers in his own lifetime. He had seen too many try and too many fail. He continued to read a great deal and to follow the struggles of workers throughout the world, but his life became quieter and quieter. He was especially interested in Russia, which he considered a likely place for a revolution, but he predicted the country that would have the first and most successful revolution would be the wealthiest, the United States of America. As he grew older, Marx was plagued by rheumatism, headaches, and bronchitis. His daughter Eleanor took him frequently to a spa at Carlsbad in hopes of a cure. It was no longer possible for Marx to write or work hard, so he spent time with books or with his grandchildren, whom he adored. He liked to play with them in his garden. He was fun and affectionate with his family, but he grew more and more short-tempered with others. He always had a reputation for being inflexible and dogmatic in his discussions, and now he became increasingly intolerant of opposing opinions. He had few friends except Engels, who defended him to the end. Likewise, Marx would accept no criticism of Engels. When Marx was 64, his wife Jenny died of cancer. A year later, his daughter Jenny also died in her late 30s. It seemed the loss of his two adored Jennies was too much for Marx. Within 2 months, he himself was dead. He died in London March 14, 1883, of an abscessed lung at the age of 65. There is a story that his last irascible words were, "Get out of here and leave me alone. Last words are for fools who haven't said enough already." At his funeral, Engels eulogized him as the best-hated and most calumniated man of his time, but added that he also died beloved, revered, and mourned by millions of revolutionary fellow workers. For 12 years after Marx died, Engels struggled to complete Das Kapital, working from the notes Marx had left behind. Engels would still be alive when Marx's reputation began to spread throughout the world, gaining wide popularity in many areas. But he, like Marx, never met Lenin or Trotsky, and never saw the Russian Revolution of 1917, which put Marx's principles into practice for the first time. 70 years after Marx died, the Communist Party erected a gravestone in London to honor him. At the top of it is Marx's quote, "Workers of all lands, unite." At the bottom is the quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." 100 years after Marx's death, a third of the world's nations could claim Marx and Engels as the founding fathers of their systems of government, and 800 million people were living under Marxist-inspired communism. The views that so inspired these people and so alienated millions of others can be summarized this way. Karl Marx believed that a capitalist system, or a bourgeois system as he also called it, inevitably leads to antagonism between classes. This is because a value of a community is its labor, or the labor put into it by its workers. Yet the capitalist takes for himself part of this value, paying the worker a wage which is less than the value of the product the worker produces. He thus cheats and exploits the laborer, and this exploitation can't be overcome until capitalism is abolished. In his work, Marx refers to current abuses in the economic system, such as the practice of keeping wages as low as possible. Yet this issue of high and low wages isn't the key issue, for Marx feels that even if the laborer is paid well, he's still being exploited, partly because he is still working to make others wealthy. Many of Marx's ideas had their roots in the philosophy of Hegel, who influenced not just Marx, but Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and the scores of philosophers who followed him. Hegel had put forth the idea that the world was in a constant process of transformation, from lower to higher orders of existence. Each new order emerged as an idea or thesis, and each thesis carried within it the seeds of its own destruction, its own opposing force or antithesis. But out of the clash between the thesis and the antithesis, a new and more perfect order would emerge. This order would be the synthesis. As an example, Hegel believed that Christianity had risen from the conflict between Greek and Hebrew thought. Christianity then became the synthesis of these two opposing ideologies. After every synthesis is complete, new ideas come in to challenge it. Conflict reoccurs, leading to yet another synthesis. This cycle would complete itself over and over until history struggled towards the ultimate synthesis, which he called the total realization of the world spirit. What Marx tried to do was to take Hegel's theory and apply it to the solid world of materialism. He grounded it in economics, which he saw as the main force of history. Marx felt that the conflict between social classes under different economic orders had created both tension and progress through the ages. In his own time, it was the merchant capitalist class that was ruling. So a new synthesis would be achieved through a proletariat or working class revolution, and the final attainment of a classless, stateless society. Marx thought a society without class division was rooted in the very beginnings of human society. He envisioned that at the dawn of history, people lived in a state of primitive communism, in which the land was owned and harvested by the tribe in common, in which there were no distinctions of class. But when private property was introduced, a division into economic classes immediately developed. In modern times, class divisions are more complicated. But Marx, although realizing this, still defined things in simple terms like the oppressed versus the oppressor, and the exploiters and the exploited. In all forms of society where there was private ownership, there would be tension and antagonism between the classes. Eventually, it becomes in the interest of the rising class of workers to overthrow existing social relations. This is when revolution takes place. Marx predicted this overthrow would occur. He wanted it to occur. He was interested in participating in it. He was what we might call an activist philosopher, and in that sense he was different from all philosophers who went before him. Marx never approached philosophy as something removed from the world of events. He thought of his philosophy as a means of transforming the world, and not simply as an interpretation of the world. He hoped and intended for his writing to have a concrete, tangible result in the material world, a world in which he was very much involved. Das Kapital was a call to action. This was an important departure from philosophers who preceded him, and even from those who followed him. Their task, in their view, was to observe or intuit, to analyze, to interpret, and then to draw a hypothesis. Many of them were people of contemplation, seclusion, and detachment from the world around them. If they were active, they were socially active, and even then confined themselves to friends and associates of scholarly circles. Emerson and Thoreau, who wrote during the same general time, advocated the philosopher-poet life of meditation, contemplation, and restricted, carefully selected company and pastimes. Even philosophers who were involved somewhat in politics, and there are very few, never used their philosophy to consciously launch a movement or a revolution. Rousseau, who was called the father of the French Revolution, never charted the course of that revolution and died before it even began. Most philosophers who wrote about government or politics did so in a theoretical sense, playing with ideas and ideals in their minds and on paper, and leaving it to the public to do what it might with the results. But Marx was unique. He was completely involved not just in creating a philosophy, but in trying to help it become manifest. The book Das Kapital is Marx's major and most important work. It took him nearly 30 years to write, and he finally released Part 1 in 1867 when he was 49. 2 years after his death, Engels had the second volume published, and 9 years after that, he released the third volume. The total book is over 1,000 pages long. When it arrived in Russia, a government censor let Das Kapital through with the comment that it's unlikely to find many readers among the general public. In Das Kapital, Marx analyzed the capitalist economy of the modern industrialized world. He examined how it works, the relationships between labor, value, wages, prices, and profits, and the ways in which the system exploited the workforce. His main focus was on the men, women, and children who lived lives of terrible poverty and intensive labor to produce the goods that made the ruling class rich. His descriptions of working conditions of the time are the most vivid and stirring parts of the book, and to some scholars, the strongest part of his message. Throughout the last few centuries, Marx stated, it had been the common worker's fate to suffer, in his words, the maximum of working time and the minimum of wages in order to supply capitalists with profits. Accumulation of wealth at one end, in one class, became contrasted with accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, and moral degradation at the other end. Marx knew the capitalist had tight control of things, but he saw that the pendulum of power had swung many times in the past, and he promised it would swing again. The proletariat, under the banner of communism, would ultimately triumph. Revolution to Marx was destined, and the ultimate historical synthesis would be a perfectly just and equal society, where everyone worked according to his ability and received according to his need. Marx felt revolution could only occur at particular times, and that his time had all the requirements. After the revolution, he foresaw a new economic structure and a new social epoch. This is the basic theory of Karl Marx. But it's more than a theory of economics, and it's more than a powerful 19th century vision of the world, which made its contribution to human thought and then disappeared into history. It's also a living and very influential system, which has attracted the faith of groups whose importance in the modern world is undeniable. The philosophy of Marx has here and there been transformed into the dogmatic creed of a party or a nation, but it's still a provocative source of thought and debate that seems to lend itself to many interpretations and directions. Behind all the theories of Marx, behind all the rhetoric and the analysis, is the very core and heart of the man. What drove Karl Marx from the time he was barely out of his teens was an overwhelming sense of injustice, indignation over human suffering, and a genuine desire to eradicate poverty. His solution was not the solution many people would have chosen, but his motivation came from a sincere belief, as he wrote way back in childhood, that the greatest men are those who have worked for the general good.